Hi everybody, I want to tell you all about this book today, Prefab by Colin Hanton, the original drummer of the Quarry Men. I want to tell you why I think there's reasons why this could be a really interesting book for Beatles fans to have a read of. So a little bit of background. Over the past 3 years I've been lucky enough, thank you very much, to Strawberry Fields in Liverpool. The original Strawberry Fields, built on a new site now. It's a great visitor centre, well worth going to visit. They've sent me 3 books over the last year. First of all, Imagine This, which was the story of Julia Baird, John's half-sister. Then there was Just Like Starting Over by Charlie Roberts, friend of the Quarry Men. This was his story of hanging out with them. And this third one, which very much feels to me like the completion of a trilogy, is Prefab, Colin Hanton and Colin Hall. So let me just explain a little bit about this book. Colin Hanton was the original drummer for the Quarry Men. When the Quarry Men first started out, even pre-Paul McCartney, when there was all sorts of people in the band on washboards and one-string T-chest basses, that kind of thing, he was there right from the start. And for a while, the group was John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison and Colin Hanton. He spent several months in that particular configuration of the band. He's written his biography here, which I've just finished reading. It's been written along with Colin Hall. Now, any of you who've been to Liverpool over the last few years and been to the John and Paul Childhood Homes tour, if you've been to Menlove Avenue in Liverpool, John's childhood home, the chances are you've been shown round by Colin Hall. He's a real expert on John Lennon's, particularly early life especially, but a real expert in that. So he's written this book along with in-depth interviews with Colin Hanton. And so I've just finished reading this, and I thought it was quite appropriate to do this here because it was actually a year ago this week that I finished reading Imagine This, and I brought my review of this from Spain. I was actually just down the road from Almeria in Spain, where John Lennon filmed How I Won the War and where he first wrote Strawberry Fields Forever. So I thought it was appropriate to do that there. I'm back in Spain at the moment. As you can see, I'm on a nice beach. It's 6:30 in the morning. I thought I'd come down early before the crowds, and I'm back in Spain exactly a year after the first one. I thought it was appropriate to come here and do this. So, Prefab. What did I think of this? Very interesting book. So it covers the story of the early Quarry Men, and to an extent John Lennon's early life, but it does sort of focus mainly on the Quarry Men. It covers that from a different perspective to what the other 2 books cover that I've read, because you've got Julia's book that was very much coming at it from a sort of a family angle. Her mum Julia, Aunt Mimi, the bigger overall family, and how John fitted into that and Julia fitted into that. Charlie Roberts was an outsider from the Quarry Men, but he was there for a lot of what went on. Colin was right there in the heart of it, right from the very start of the Quarry Men. So it's his life story as well. So you get some interesting things. And what I found with these books is that they're very interesting as a kind of social history of Britain in the 1940s, 50s. What it was like to be a teenager growing up in that time, because it was the birth of the word teenager, wasn't it, around that time? So me obviously not being around in those days, it's very interesting for me to see, for example, somebody who's almost an identical age to my dad, what kind of life those people were living back in that time. So it's really interesting from a social history point of view, but it gets particularly interesting, and it starts to really take off for me once the Quarry Men form, and especially from the section that goes from July 6, 1957 onwards, that Woolton Village fete where John and Paul were first properly introduced to each other. It's been said that they'd bumped into each other on an occasion beforehand, but properly bumped into each other that day. Colin was there. He was playing with the Quarry Men that day. He was on that lorry that was riding through. He was in the field playing. But what I like about this book is it doesn't try to make things out to be epic events if they weren't on the day. So I don't want to give too much away about the book, as I often say about these things. If you're interested in what's in here, I would encourage you to buy it. And there will be links all over. I don't get paid any commission or anything for these books. So I'm not making anything off sales of this, but they did send me this so that I would have a read of it and hopefully bring you a review. But yeah, it doesn't make it out to be an epic event if it wasn't on the day. So he explains about on Saturday 6th of July 1957, when there was that introduction of John and Paul. Some of the band weren't there. One of them had nipped off to the loo. A couple of them had popped home to have some tea before they came back for the evening session of the Fete. Such was the complete irrelevance of that encounter on the day, of just one teenage lad meeting another teenage lad. You know, who gave a toss about that? So he doesn't try to make it out to be some sort of massive, you know, dramatic music playing in the background event. You know, nobody took any notice of this at the time, other than John and Paul and maybe one or two people who were stood around, not realising the significance. So I like how he does that. And it gets really, really interesting from the point where Paul joins, and it gives us some really good detail of the timeline of, you know, what happened after John and Paul met on that day, in terms of the timeline of not just Paul joining the band, but when did he have his first rehearsals? How did they go? When did he have his first gig? How did that go? And we get a lot of detail about that in this book, which is really good. And remember, we're still talking pre-George here. So we learn about the early gigs with John and Paul together. We learn a lot more about the process of how George came into the band, and how those rehearsals went, and how those first gigs went with George. It wasn't too long after George came that Colin's time in the band came to an end. We hear all about that, about how that was basically just one big sulk and explosive rant from Colin on a bus one night in the direction of Paul McCartney, and he walked off the bus, and that was it. He was no longer in the Quarry Men. So that was really interesting to hear about. But I think for me the most fascinating part of the book is around the build up to and the recording session for, you know, when the Beatles, the Quarry Men as they were then, went into a studio just in a guy called Percy Phillips' house in Liverpool and recorded That'll Be the Day and In Spite of All the Danger. So, you know, the two songs that made it onto Anthology 1. Now, in terms of the detail that it gives of the build up to that session, the rehearsals that they had, and the actual day itself in that studio, and how Colin can so accurately date when it happened, because it's been documented in all sorts of places as been a date that Colin gives evidence and proof as to why it couldn't possibly have been the date that it's often associated with. He goes into so much detail about this, and I'm reading it and thinking, I don't remember reading all this in Tune In, for example, in Mark Lewison's Tune In. So I went back, actually. I've got it on my Kindle here. I've got Tune In. So I went back and read the section all around this recording session, and I can tell you now that this book has got way more detail in about the recording of those songs and how that went down than even Tune In has. Way more detail. So I learned a lot from that. So I think if you're interested in the early career of John Lennon and the Quarry Men, this is a really, really good trilogy that comes at it from all different angles. But in terms of this one's more, as I say, about John and his family, so it touches on the Quarry Men, but Julia wasn't there, and she knows it wasn't really her story to tell because she wasn't there. So that's really good from John's sort of personal and family life. Incredible. This is a really good book of somebody on the outside looking in. This is somebody who's actually there on the inside, and like I say, for a while that band was John, Paul, George and Colin. So, you know, this guy's got a great story to tell. This book goes bang up to date as well. When it's talking about In Spite of All the Danger, it mentions that it's had something of a renaissance in the last few years. Paul McCartney's been playing it live, and it even mentions in the book that it was part of his Glastonbury set last year. So that gives you an idea of just how recently this book came out. It does intriguingly say as well, and I don't know anything about this, if any of you do, let me know. It says, now a feature-length documentary film. And it does say on the back as well, Prefab has been made into a feature-length documentary film that is coming soon. I don't know anything about that, so I'd be really interested to know more, because I would love to see that. So yeah, if you're wanting to sort of get down and dirty into the deep, intricate detail of the Quarry Men and John Lennon's sort of early days in the band, and how Paul was brought in and how George was brought in, tuning by Mark Lewison is obviously great and fantastic, but I can tell you that this brings more detail to the table, and Colin always is able to sort of back it up with facts as to how he knows if there's any discrepancy or dispute about a date. He will always back up why he says it must have been this date. So he's really good at sort of backing up the facts where he's making a claim that differs maybe from what you've seen before. So yeah, I would definitely recommend this book. I'm going to put links in the comments section and in the description for the Strawberry Fields website. They're selling these. I would say as well, they're selling all these books, and they are all signed by the authors, because thankfully the authors of all these books are still with us. So you can see there that's signed by the two Collins. The Charlie Roberts one, I did mention in a video I did for this, but Charlie Roberts was the guy who organised this concert on Rosebery Street, which was just a couple of weeks before the Woolton Village Fete in July '57. He arranged that, and he was a good friend with the band. He signed that up at the top there. And the Julia Baird one, really great book this. All their copies again are signed on the website, so I hope that's of interest to some of you. Definitely recommend picking up that book. Well, it's 6:45 in the morning now. I've got a busy day ahead of me, lying around a pool and drinking beer. That's going to be fun. Thank you very much for watching anyway. Leave your comments down below as always, and I will see you back very soon from England. Cheers. Bye.